My mother's hand went to her throat the moment she saw me walk through those doors. That's the image I keep coming back to. Her fingers pressed against her collarbone like she was trying to hold something in. My father sat beside her, and the color drained from his face so completely that the man next to him actually leaned over to ask if he was all right. The hearing room was quiet, the way formal rooms always are, that particular silence that belongs to institutions, to places where decisions carry weight. My heels clicked against the polished floor. I walked to the front table and set down my folder, and then, slowly, I turned around. 12 years. 12 years since my father told me I had disappointed him. 12 years since my mother stopped returning my calls. 12 years since my sister Claire convinced them I had walked away from medical school in disgrace and that I was too ashamed to tell anyone the truth. But I was not ashamed. I was a surgeon. And the white coat I was wearing that morning, with my name and credentials embroidered on the chest, told them everything before I ever opened my mouth. To understand how we ended up in that room, you have to go back to a smaller place. A small city in northern Ontario called Sudbury. If you've never been, it's the kind of place that builds a particular type of person, practical, self-reliant, not given to exaggeration. The land around it is Canadian Shield, all granite and boreal forest. Winters run long and cold and honest. My father, David Arsenault, spent 30 years working underground for one of the nickel mining companies. He came home most evenings with a particular kind of tiredness that settled deep in the bones. My mother Louise worked as an administrative assistant at the school board and ran our house with quiet efficiency. Dinner was always ready. Birthdays were never forgotten. The lawn was cut before anyone on the street thought to do theirs. My sister Claire was 4 years older than me, and growing up she was the one who lit up rooms. Funny, social, the first to say the right thing at exactly the right moment. Teachers remembered her. Neighbors asked after her. My parents talked about her the way people talk about someone they can't quite believe belongs to them. I was different. I wasn't unhappy, but I was interior. I liked reading. I liked being precise about things. While Claire was out at bush parties on Friday nights, I was at the kitchen table working through biology textbooks 2 grades ahead of where I needed to be. By the time I was 17, I knew what I wanted. Medicine. Not because anyone pushed me toward it, but because it was the only thing that consistently made sense to me, the logic of the body, the weight of getting it right, the idea that careful attention to detail could be the difference between someone going home or not going home. When I told my parents at dinner one evening, my mother looked up from her plate and smiled in a way that was both proud and slightly frightened. My father set down his fork and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you're going to do this, you see it through to the end." That sentence stayed with me for a long time afterward, for reasons he never expected. I left Sudbury for McMaster University in Hamilton the following September. The health sciences program was rigorous in a way that suited me. I wasn't the most naturally gifted student in the room, but I was consistent and I did not quit on hard things. I wrote home every couple of weeks. My mother wrote back about neighborhood news and whether the furnace had been serviced. My father's notes were short, 3 lines at most. Working hard, I hope. His version of affection. Claire was living in Sudbury then, working at a marketing agency downtown. She called our parents every Sunday. I could picture her at their kitchen table, charming and present in a way I had never quite managed from a distance. The trouble started about 8 months into my first year. I tried calling home on a Thursday evening, and the line rang through to voicemail. I tried again the following Sunday. My father answered, but something in his voice was off. Flat. Careful in a way he wasn't usually careful with me. "How are things?" I asked. "Fine," he said. And then, "We heard you've been having some difficulties." I didn't understand at first. "What kind of difficulties?" He cleared his throat. "Claire mentioned you might be thinking of leaving the program." I remember standing in my small residence room, holding the phone very still. "Where did she hear that?" He didn't answer the question directly. He said, "If things aren't working out, you can come home. No shame in it." I told him clearly I was not leaving. I was doing well. I had no idea where that information had come from. He said he was glad to hear it and ended the call. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. A rumor that had gotten garbled somewhere between Hamilton and Sudbury. These things happen. Families misinterpret things. But the calls became more strained after that. And then, around the middle of my second year, they became rare. I would reach out and receive responses that were polite but distant, the way you respond to someone you feel obligated to, rather than someone you're glad to hear from. I kept calling anyway, kept writing. Then I came home for Thanksgiving. The drive from Hamilton to Sudbury takes about 4 hours through the Shield. I made it in late October, the birch trees already stripped bare. The house looked the same. The garden beds had been put to sleep for winter, the way my mother always did them, everything tidy, everything in its place. My father opened the door. He looked at me the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet. We sat at the kitchen table. My mother made tea. And then my father said, without meeting my eyes, "Claire told us you failed your first-year assessments, that you'd been asked to repeat." I set down my mug. "That is not true." He looked up. "She said you told her yourself." "I have never told her that because it has never happened. I am in good standing. I can show you my transcripts." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, but in the way someone shakes their head when they don't want to process what they're hearing. "You've always been hard on yourself," he said. "Maybe you just need some time." I wasn't hard on myself. I was telling him the truth, and he was choosing not to hear it. My mother said quietly, "Claire was worried about you. She only said something because she cares." I sat at that table for another hour trying to explain. The words kept coming back wrong, or not landing, or landing somewhere beside where they needed to go. When I finally stood to leave, my father looked at me from across the kitchen and said, "I hope things turn around." He had already decided the story, and I wasn't the one who had written it. I drove back to Hamilton that night with the radio off. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking that eventually someone would say something, that Claire would correct the record, that my parents would ask to see proof, that common sense would reassert itself. But the calls grew shorter. Then they stopped coming from their end entirely. I kept reaching out, but by the end of my second year I understood that something had shifted in a way I couldn't fix from a distance. So I did what you do when you can't solve the thing in front of you. I went back to work. Medical school is not designed to leave you much room for anything other than itself. The hours are long in a way that teaches you something about what you're actually made of. I was in anatomy lab before sunrise. I was reviewing case studies after midnight. I ate poorly, and slept in patches, and somewhere in the middle of all of it I discovered that I was good at this in a way that surprised even me. Not because I was the fastest or the loudest in the room, but because I stayed calm when things became uncertain. My supervising resident told me once, during a particularly complicated simulation, "You don't rattle easy." She meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. I sent Christmas cards home every December, just simple ones. A few lines. "Thinking of you. I'm well. I hope you're well." The first year I got no response. The second year my mother sent a brief note back. The third year, nothing. I kept sending them regardless. Something in me refused to let the silence become permanent, even if the door had been pulled mostly closed. Around the time I was finishing my second year of residency, something else happened. Something good. I met Daniel. Daniel Kowalczyk was a pediatric physiotherapist at the same hospital in Toronto where I was completing my surgical residency. He had the particular quality of stillness you sometimes see in people who spend their days with sick children, a practiced patience, a refusal to panic, a kind of warmth that wasn't performed. We met properly in the hospital cafeteria at 6 in the morning when I was on my 4th consecutive hour shift, and he had come in early to catch up on patient notes. I was staring at a cup of bad coffee like it had personally failed me. He sat down across from me without being invited. "You look like someone told you the hospital was out of coffee," he said. I laughed before I could stop myself. Daniel never asked a lot of questions about my family in the beginning. He listened when I offered things, and he didn't push when I didn't. He understood the rhythms of hospital life intuitively. The absences, the unpredictability, the way your world can narrow down to a single operating room for 16 hours and then suddenly open back up. 2 years later, we got married at a small ceremony in the Distillery District in Toronto. A few colleagues, a few old friends from university. I sent an invitation to Sudbury. No response. But standing in that courtyard with Daniel's hand in mine, the absence felt smaller than it had before. He had a way of making things feel more possible. Our son Marcus arrived 18 months after that. If you've ever been handed a newborn, that particular moment when they're placed against you and they're warm and impossibly small and already entirely themselves, you understand why everything rearranges. Marcus had Daniel's patience and something of my stubbornness, which Daniel said was equal parts terrifying and reassuring. He also had grandparents he had never met. I sent a letter to Sudbury with a photograph of Marcus in a small blue blanket. I wrote, "You have a grandson." I waited. No reply came. Life moved forward the way it does. Marcus grew. Daniel and I found our footing as parents in the particular chaotic fashion of two people who both work hospital hours. I moved through my residency and into a fellowship in general surgery, and then into a staff position at a mid-sized hospital in Mississauga. The work was hard in the way. Good work is hard. It demanded everything, and in return gave you something that didn't come from anywhere else. There were moments, usually in the evenings after Marcus had gone to bed, when the quiet of the house would settle in and I would think about Sudbury, about the kitchen table, about my father's voice saying, "I hope things turn around," as though he were talking to someone he had already written off. I didn't let myself stay there long. The Navy, the version of it I had built for myself, the medicine, the discipline, the years of making good on the promise of seeing it through. That was the answer to whatever story my family had chosen to believe. Not because I was trying to prove something, but because it was true. I was in my office reviewing a morning consult schedule when the call came in from the hospital's credentialing office. A new case had been flagged for internal review. Irregular billing documentation associated with a physiotherapy services contract. The name on the file was Claire Arsenault-Bouchard, my sister. I sat with that information for a long moment. Claire had gone into healthcare administration several years earlier, as far as I knew. I hadn't spoken to her directly in almost a decade. Our lives had diverged completely, or so I had assumed. But healthcare in Ontario is a smaller world than people realize. Hospitals contract, networks overlap, and records have a way of moving between institutions that no one fully accounts for. The file detailed a pattern of overbilling for physiotherapy services at a clinic where Claire held an administrative oversight role. The discrepancies weren't catastrophic in scale, but they were systematic, consistent, repeated, clearly not accidental. The kind of pattern that survives an initial audit but falls apart under a proper investigation. And a proper investigation had been launched. The hearing was scheduled through the hospital's internal compliance process, with representation from the Provincial Health Authority, standard procedure for billing irregularities of this scope. My department head, Dr. Okafor, a careful, methodical woman who had spent most of her career building systems that were harder to misuse than to use properly, called me into her office the week before the hearing. She gestured at the chair. She said, "I understand you have a personal connection to the individual named in the compliance review." Yes. She studied me for a moment. "Your name came up in connection with the professional oversight component. You have relevant expertise in documentation standards." She paused. "We can assign someone else without difficulty." I thought about that. In one direction, there was the obvious route. Step aside. Let someone else carry the file. Avoid the whole complicated tangle of family and institution, and a decade of silence. In the other direction was the simpler truth. I knew the documentation. I knew the standards. I knew how to read a billing record and identify where accountability had broken down. And the system functioned on people being willing to do their jobs even when it was uncomfortable. "I can handle it," I said. She nodded. Then she added, "Your parents have been notified. They'll likely attend." That sentence settled into the room differently than anything else she'd said. My parents. People I hadn't seen in 12 years. People who believed, based on what my sister had told them, that I had failed out of medical school. I drove home that evening and told Daniel over dinner. Marcus was building something elaborate with wooden blocks at the other end of the table, and the ordinariness of the scene was a steadying thing. Daniel said, "How are you feeling about it?" "Uncertain," I said honestly. He nodded. "You know what Claire did. You know what your parents chose to believe." He looked at me. "None of that changes who you've actually become." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The morning of the hearing I was up before Marcus. Old habit early mornings had been mine since medical school. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror in my white coat, the one with my name on the left chest panel. Dr. Rachel Arsenault, General Surgery. The fabric was pressed. The stethoscope was around my neck out of long practice rather than necessity. I looked at myself for a moment and tried to feel something definitive, but all I felt was steady. Marcus wandered in, dragging his stuffed rabbit by one ear. He looked up at me with the specific seriousness of a 4-year-old. "You're wearing your doctor coat," he observed. "I am." "Is someone sick?" "No. Just a meeting." He considered this. "Okay. Then he went to find his father. Daniel appeared in the doorway. Ready? I took a breath. Let's go. The compliance hearing room was on the third floor of the Health Authority building in downtown Toronto, a room that managed to be both generic and formal at once. Institutional carpet, a long table, fluorescent lighting softened just enough to be bearable. I arrived early. I always arrived early. I arranged my documents and sat down. I did not look immediately toward the gallery seating. When I finally turned, they were already there. My father, his hair fully gray now, heavier through the shoulders than I remembered. My mother, smaller somehow, her hands folded in her lap the way she always folded them when she was nervous. They were looking at the front of the room. Then my mother's eyes moved. They found me. The recognition landed in her face the way something drops sudden and irreversible. My father turned. His body went absolutely still. Neither of them moved. The hearing room carried that particular ambient sound of an institutional space papers shifting, a chair adjusting, someone coughing lightly near the back. But in the row where my parents sat, there was something that had no sound at all. I held their gaze for a moment. Then I turned back to my documents. The compliance officer called the room to order. The process began in the careful, procedural language that formal institutions use: dates, accounts, audit periods, documentation standards. I presented the technical component of the oversight review, what the billing records showed, where the irregularities occurred, how the pattern had developed over time. Claire was present with her legal representative. She looked different, older in the way that time accumulates rather than the way hard living does. When I entered the room, she had looked up, and then she had looked away, and she had not looked back. Twice during the proceedings, I felt my parents' attention on me the way you feel weather changing. I didn't turn around either time. During the midday break, I was standing in the hallway reviewing notes when I heard my mother's voice behind me. Rachel. I turned. She was standing a few feet away. My father just behind her. She looked like someone trying to solve a problem she had been given without all the necessary information. Yes, Mum. Her voice came out uncertain. You're a doctor. Yes. She blinked. She looked at the embroidered panel on my coat. General surgery. That's right. My father stepped forward slowly. He looked at my name on the coat for a moment longer than necessary. His voice came out lower than I remembered it. How long? 11 years. 3 of residency and fellowship, 8 as staff. He absorbed that silently. 8 years as a practicing surgeon. He did the math the way my father always did math, quietly, exactly, without shortcuts. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said, Claire told us you left. I know. He looked at the floor. That you were asked to withdraw. I know what she told you. He raised his eyes. You're not angry. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like he was trying to understand the terrain. I thought about that. I'm not angry, I said. I was, for a while, but that's a long time to stay in one feeling. My mother pressed her hand to her mouth briefly. We missed, she started. And then she stopped. We missed everything, my father said quietly. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard from him before. He had spent 30 years underground, had been a man who moved through hard things by moving through them and not talking about them. What I was hearing now was something different. Not emotion exactly, something more structural than that. The sound of a certainty collapsing. I said, carefully, you had all the information you needed to find out the truth. I sent cards every year. My return address was on every envelope. He closed his eyes briefly. You could have called the hospital, I said. Any hospital in Hamilton or Toronto. They would have confirmed I was there. I know, he said. I know that. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a long time. A couple of people passed us in the hallway, glancing briefly at the small cluster of us against the wall. Finally, he said, because if I called and found out you were there, I would have had to accept that we chose wrong. There it was. Not cruelty. Not indifference. Something smaller and harder: pride. The same quality that had made him good at his job and difficult to reach. The same quality I had apparently inherited in a different form. My mother said, the Christmas cards. Her voice was unsteady. We kept them. I looked at her. You got them. She nodded. All of them. Every year. For a moment I didn't speak. I had assumed, after the first few years of silence, that they had gone unread. That the envelopes had been set aside or returned. But they had been kept. 12 years of them, Somewhere in the house on the street. I'd grown up on. Why didn't you answer? My mother looked at my father. He looked at the carpet. Then he said, "Same reason, I suppose." Behind them, the hearing room door had opened. Claire stood in the doorway. When she saw the three of us together, she stopped walking. My parents turned. For a moment, the four of us occupied the same piece of hallway for the first time in longer than I could account for. My father looked at my sister. The expression on his face was not anger, not yet. It was the expression of a man beginning to understand the shape of something that had been invisible to him for a long time. "Claire," he said. Just her name. But the tone of it carried a question she couldn't deflect. She looked at me. Something in her expression was complicated. Not fully remorseful, not defensive, but somewhere in between the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been asked to set it down. "I didn't think it would matter so much," she said finally. "It was to my parents, not to me." My mother's voice was very quiet. "You told us she failed." "I know. You said she told you herself." Claire pressed her lips together. I made an assumption. She was struggling in first year. Everyone struggles in first year. "I struggled and kept going," I said. "That's different from failing." She looked at the floor. "I know." My father took one slow breath. "When you assumed she had left, did you correct it? At any point in 12 years, did you ever correct it?" The silence that followed answered the question. He shook his head, once. The same way he used to when we were children, and something had gone wrong that couldn't be undone by arguing about it. He didn't say anything more to her. He turned back to me. "I should have asked questions," he said. "Yes," I said. He nodded. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, but something behind it was less steady. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I had waited 12 years to hear that sentence, and when it arrived it was smaller and larger than I expected, the way significant things usually are." The hearing reconvened. The rest of the proceedings moved efficiently. Additional documentation, final statements, the compliance officer outlining the next steps in the investigation process. Claire's file would be referred for formal regulatory review. The clinic contract would be suspended pending audit. These things take months to resolve. The system is thorough and not fast. When the room finally cleared, my parents were waiting outside. My mother asked quietly, "Could we see him sometime?" "Your son." I thought about Marcus at home with Daniel, building things out of wooden blocks, entirely unaware that any of this was happening. Children don't carry the weight adults pile onto things. They meet people and decide in about 30 seconds whether they like them. "I think he'd like that," I said. 3 weeks later, my parents made the drive down from Sudbury on a Saturday afternoon. 4 hours on the 400, the same route I had driven in the opposite direction, the autumn I left for university. Daniel made a proper dinner. Marcus was riding his balance bike up and down the front path when their car pulled up. He stopped pedaling and watched them get out of the car. Then he looked at me. "Are those the grandparents from Sudbury?" "Yes." He looked back at them with the frank evaluative gaze of a 4-year-old. "Okay." My mother crouched down in the driveway. Marcus walked over to her without hesitation, examined her face at close range, and said, "Did you bring anything?" My father laughed, a real one, surprised out of him. He had brought a bag of Verters from the gas station, the old-fashioned kind, the same ones that used to sit in a bowl on my grandmother's end table when I was small. He held the bag out. Marcus took it solemnly. My mother's eyes filled. She stood up and pressed her hand to her mouth. "He looks like you," she said. "He has his father's patience," I said. "Thank goodness." We sat at the patio table until the light changed. Conversation moved through careful territory at first, the drive down, Marcus's interests, the neighborhood. But small things loosened gradually. My father asked about the hospital. My mother asked about the surgery. Real questions, the kind that required real answers, not the careful, provisional small talk of people holding each other at a manageable distance. Before they left that evening, my father brought something in from the car, a shoebox. Not the kind that holds shoes, the kind that holds paper. He set it on the kitchen counter without ceremony. Inside were the Christmas cards. 12 years of them, the envelope still sealed, still addressed in my own handwriting. "I couldn't get rid of them," he said. I looked at the stack. Then I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Nothing would give those years back. Not the cards. Not the conversation in the hallway. Not Marcus climbing onto my mother's lap and asking her to read him a book, which she did, for 45 minutes. in a voice I hadn't heard since I was very small. None of that could replace what the distance had cost, the promotions they hadn't seen, the wedding they hadn't attended, the first years of their grandson's life. But a door that had been closed for a long time was open again. My sister's regulatory process is still ongoing. I don't know what the final outcome will be. She called me once, about 2 months after the hearing. The conversation was short and careful. The way first conversations are when too much needs to be covered and neither person is sure where to start. She said she was sorry. I said I believed her. We haven't spoken again since then, but I haven't closed the door either. My parents came back for Marcus's birthday in the spring. My mother brought a lemon cake from the bakery in Sudbury that she used to make for our birthdays when we were children. Marcus decided it was the best cake he had ever had, which he announced with the full diplomatic authority of a 4-year-old. My father sat in the backyard with Daniel for an hour talking about, of all things, hockey analytics, which neither of them had mentioned to me as an interest before, and which apparently they shared extensively. One afternoon, a few months after everything settled, my father and I sat together on the front porch while Marcus kicked a ball around the front yard. He watched him for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I told people, all those years, that my daughter was in medicine." I turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on Marcus. Even when we thought you'd left. Old habit. He was quiet. I just stopped giving the details. Something in that landed differently than I expected. He had held on to the version of me that was true, even while he believed a version that wasn't. Pride is a complicated thing. It protects and it isolates in the same motion. I've been thinking about what I would tell someone in the situation I was in, caught between a story someone else told and a truth no one was asking to hear. I don't have a clean answer. What I know is that the Navy, the version of it I carried with me, kept going even when no one at home knew it was moving. The work continued. The truth was preserved not in argument or confrontation, but simply in the living of it, year after year, until the moment when it walked into a room and spoke for itself without a single word. If this story brought something up for you, a phone call you've been putting off, a question you haven't asked, a door you've been standing outside of, I hope you take the step. The honest conversation is almost always harder to have than the one you've been rehearsing, but it's the one that actually goes somewhere. Thank you for listening. If stories like this one mean something to you, I'd be glad to have you stay for the next one.